Good evening, everybody. Welcome to our annual Silha lecture. My name is Jane Kirtley, and I'm the Silha Center's director and also the Silha professor. And as you know, we're based here at the University of Minnesota in Hubbard School of Journalism and Mass Communication. And we're so happy that so many of you turned out to join us tonight. This year's lecture topic could not be more timely. I said the same thing last year, but it's even truer, I think, perhaps this year. Some of you may remember that Time magazine named what they called the Silence Breakers as the 2017 Person of the Year, recognizing the Me Too movement. Numerous individuals have been accusing powerful men of sexual misconduct, among them film producer Harvey Weinstein, who you'll be hearing more about soon, Matt Lauer, a former co-host of NBC's Today Show, Garrison Keillor, Al Franken. The Me Too movement raises many First Amendment issues, too, including how to protect the free speech rights of the women who allege sexual harassment, as well as the use of defamation lawsuits by accusers and the accused. Tonight's lecture is uniquely qualified to discuss these and other issues. Ted Boutros, Theodore J. Boutros, who I've known for many years, is representing actor Ashley Judd in her libel suit against Weinstein. And I'll tell you more about Ted in a few minutes. But first, I have to take a moment to say thank you. Many of you know that the Silha Center was established in 1984 with a generous endowment from the late Otto Silha, who was the president and publisher of the Minneapolis Star and the Minneapolis Tribune, together with his wife, Helen. Sadly, Helen is not with us tonight. She passed away on October 21st, 2017, just a short time after our last annual lecture, which she was fortunately able to attend. Even after Otto's death in 1999, even though she was not a journalist herself, Helen remained very much involved in the Silha Center events and rarely missed any of them. She took a keen interest in the media law topics we explored at the Silha Center and loved talking with our many lecturers and cared a lot about not just journalism but media ethics, just as her husband Otto had. She was an educated and intellectually curious layperson and a concerned citizen, and she was always a very welcome presence for us, and we miss her very much. Happily, some members of the Silha family are with us tonight, and I want to mention them all to you. It includes sons Stephen and Mark, daughter Alice Ryman and her husband John, and grandson Johnny. We are so grateful for Otto's vision and for your family's continued support for more than 30 years, and I hope that the Silha Center will continue to serve as a living testament to Otto and Helen's values, vision, and memory. So thank you. I also just want to acknowledge the director of the Hubbard School of Journalism and Mass Communication, Dr. Alicia Cohen, who since her arrival at the school in 2017 has given her enthusiastic support and presence to our event. So thank you, Alicia. Some of you may have seen copies of the Silha Center's 3 times a year newsletter, The Bulletin, which covers emerging issues in media law and ethics and is researched and written by our Silha research assistants. There are copies of the Bulletin outside if you haven't picked one up. The Silha funding, among many other things, has supported the work of dozens of graduate and law student Silha fellows and research assistants. Our 3 current Silha RAs have all been instrumental in ensuring the success of tonight's lecture, and I would like to thank all of them for their efforts, Scott Memel, Kirsten Norson, and Sarah Wiley, who are here somewhere. And finally, this event could not take place without the very hard work and commitment of our Silha program assistant, Elaine Hargrove. Okay, so every year we offer programs that draw the public into an ongoing discussion about ethical and legal issues facing the media. And tonight's lecture is the 33rd in the series that has become the Silha Center's signature event, providing a platform for distinguished and innovative thinkers from the journalism, ethics, and law fields to share their insights and expertise. And our lecturer tonight follows that tradition of excellence. Ted Boutros is a partner in the Los Angeles office of Gibson, Dunn & Crutcher. He's also global co-chair of the litigation group at his law firm and has extensive experience handling high-profile litigation, media relations, and media law issues. He's a native of North Dakota, received his law degree summa cum laude from the University of San Diego School of Law in 1987, where he was valedictorian and editor-in-chief of the Law Review. According to the National Law Journal, which named him one of the 100 most influential lawyers in America, Ted is known for his wise strategic advice to clients in crisis and is a media law star. He has argued complex civil, constitutional, and criminal matters in more than 100 appeals, including before the U.S. Supreme Court, 12 Federal Circuit Court of Appeals, 10 state Supreme Courts, and many other appellate trial courts. He successfully persuaded courts to overturn some of the largest jury verdicts in class actions in history, including one of the largest defamation verdicts of all time involving the Wall Street Journal. He's also a frequent commentator on legal issues. His many articles include "Why I'll Defend Anyone Trump Sues for Speaking Freely," which he published in Politico on Halloween of 2016, as well as many others in the Wall Street Journal and the New York Times. He's a member of the advisory board of the International Women's Media Foundation and was its 2015 leadership honoree. He's an old friend of mine. We worked together in Washington, and I'm just thrilled that he's here tonight. Please join me in welcoming Ted.
Good evening, everyone, and thank you so much, Jane. It's so great to see you again. I feel like I'm part of the Silha Center family because when Professor Kirtley left the Reporters Committee for Freedom of the Press, she put all the media lawyers around the country that she'd worked with on the list. So suddenly I started getting this great bulletin with media law, breaking news, and commentary and analysis. It's just fantastic. And as Professor Kirtley noted, I grew up in North Dakota. Some of my friends from North Dakota who now live here in Minneapolis are here, and my sister and my niece are here. And to me, Minneapolis was like heaven because Bismarck didn't have anything like buildings or people. So coming to Minneapolis has always been something I love doing. So I'm really honored to be here and to talk about these important issues. The meat is, let me just back up on my career. As Professor Kirtley was mentioning, much of my career spent defending news organizations and reporters, and it still is, against defamation claims and fighting for the widest possible First Amendment freedoms we can have. And when I started looking at these issues in connection with my case for Ashley Judd and thinking about the First Amendment aspects of it, it hadn't really dawned on me that the Me Too movement is one of the most remarkable First Amendment movements in the history of our country. It really shows how the speech and individuals, famous people and private people speaking out about an issue, bringing it out from the shadows, having a national, global dialogue about an issue can change society, and it can remove barriers and at least start removing barriers that have subjugated certain groups in our country through speech. So the Me Too movement is all about speech, and so I start with that premise. And Rebecca Traister has a new book out called Good and Mad, The Revolutionary Power of Women's Anger. And she talks about how, in her words, the expression of, quote, female rage in America has a long and righteous history, and that we are in a potentially revolutionary moment with the potential for a big alteration in who has power in this country, close quote. The Me Too movement is part of that. And so I want to talk about the Me Too movement in the context of speech and free speech, but then I want to explain how someone like me, who spent his career fighting off defamation claims and saying that they're bad. Our firm has a policy against bringing defamation claims without special permission. I happen to be on the management committee, so I was able to approve my action in this case. Everyone agreed with me, though. It was unanimous. So it's ingrained in my fiber that defamation claims are something that you're usually fighting. But as I'll explain in more detail, the case that we brought for Ashley Judd is really completely different, raises completely different issues than the First Amendment issues that I confront when I'm representing a reporter or a news organization. The claim, I'll give you more detail on this, but in essence is that Harvey Weinstein defamed Ashley Judd, trashed her professionalism, to retaliate against her for rebuffing his inappropriate sexual advances. And that really changed the trajectory of her career in a serious way. And the reason that Ashley wanted to bring this lawsuit was to take all this energy and momentum from the Me Too movement and take the next step and have legal action that can really continue to change the world and improve the professional arc for all women and all men who might confront harassment and retaliation in the workplace. So the defamation claim is easy for me to reconcile because it doesn't involve public debate or public controversy or one person saying one thing and making an accusation about an issue of public concern, but rather it was a purely, we allege, malicious effort to injure someone for inappropriate, obviously, reasons. So I'll elaborate on that. The other thing I'm going to touch on is, much of the Me Too movement focuses on the social media platforms. That's where it really took off, beginning about a year ago. And the social media platforms change a lot of the dynamics that led to some of the First Amendment doctrines that protect free speech and free press. So I'm going to talk a little bit about that. And then finally, my main thesis, even though I'm here to talk a little bit about the defamation claim I brought, is that we need strong First Amendment protections now more than ever, in particularly because of the political climate. The front page today talks about Jamal Khashoggi. The front page actually covers both, the New York Times covers both of my topics in the sense of journalism and this horrible event that took place with respect to Jamal Khashoggi. And then we have the President of the United States saying, the headline is "Horseface Lowlife, How the President Demeans Women." And so I think the two kind of come together in a way. We need to protect journalism because it's really the way for citizens to learn and discuss issues of public concern that allow citizens to govern themselves. And so I'm going to touch on that as well. First, the Me Too movement. How did it start? Tarana Burke was an activist who about 10 years ago really started this movement as a way to bring survivors of sexual violence together and to get them remedies and relief where possible. But things really started to pick up steam, to my mind, when Gretchen Carlson sued for sexual harassment and brought that case in 2017 in the summer, or excuse me, 2016 in the summer. And it didn't take very long for Fox and Roger Ailes for there to be a settlement. It was about a $20 million settlement. But it really brought attention to the fact that there are these hidden pockets of ongoing sexual harassment, even in the high echelons of the entertainment industry, the news industry, where the individuals who are the victims actually have, relatively speaking, a lot of power, but they're still were being subjected to this sort of behavior. The next big moment, to my mind, in what became the Me Too movement was the Access Hollywood tape, and I'm going to spare you all and not play it again. But as you all recall, it caught then candidate Trump saying very inappropriate things and describing things that he had done to women that were clearly, manifestly wrong. And there was an outcry. And then a number of other women came forward and talked about their experiences with Mr. Trump, some dating back many years. I think, and it was over a dozen women came out and told their stories, and the New York Times published an article, and Mr. Trump threatened at that point to sue the New York Times, which he never did. But then on October 22, this was candidate Trump's Gettysburg Address. Rather than talking about the country and the serious issues, he then vowed to sue every woman that had made an accusation against him. So I'm just going to play that clip so you can all remember what that sounded like.
Every woman lied when they came forward to hurt my campaign. Total fabrication. The events never happened. Never. All of these liars will be sued after the election is over. But a simple phone call placed to the biggest newspapers or television networks gets them wall-to-wall coverage with virtually no fact-checking whatsoever. Here is why this is relevant to you. If they can fight somebody like me, who has unlimited resources to fight back, just look at what they can do to you, your jobs, your security, your education, your health care, the violation of religious liberty, the theft of your Second Amendment, the loss of your factories, your homes, and much more. Look at what they've done to you with your jobs.
So I didn't remember that big non sequitur there when I went back to look at the tape, that your Second Amendment rights are going to be threatened because women can, during a political campaign, talk and speak out about the presidential candidate having, in some instances, assaulted them or engaged in other sexually inappropriate behavior. The merits of that, I think, are highly dubious. But to me, I was sitting in my house and with my wife, Helen, we were watching this, and I just thought it was so outrageous that a presidential candidate, put politics aside, that where we're talking about the essence of political speech and First Amendment activity, citizens bravely coming forward and explaining a personal experience that they had that they viewed as relevant to whether that individual should be elected. And for the candidate who's at this point getting money from the Republican National Committee, sort of a governmental entity in essence, threatening to sue them for libel. And I just thought it was really outrageous from a First Amendment perspective. So I decided to tweet about it, and I did screen it with my wife just to make sure I wasn't going too far. But I vowed to represent pro bono anyone Trump sues for exercising their free speech rights, and a number of lawyers had already kind of reached out to me. So I did it like instantly that day, and in response, my tweets at that time would get at best like 2 likes maybe, or 5 retweets, but this one got like 22,000 likes and 15,000 retweets, and lawyers from all over the country, Republicans, Democrats, said, famous law professors, famous lawyers, not famous people, just people came, paralegals, said, we'll help you. And it was really interesting because the reason I thought it was important to do this is the threats of lawsuits can deter people from speaking and can deter journalists from engaging in journalism. And Mr. Trump was already notorious at that point for threatening libel suits. Once in a while he'd bring one, and he brought one against the journalist Tim O'Brien for daring to say that Mr. Trump's net worth was less than he was claiming, and Mr. Trump lost. But usually he would have his lawyers, and he still does this, send these terrorizing letters to journalists, and here we're talking about citizens saying, we're going to sue you, it's going to be expensive, you better stop. So I felt that it was important for the women who had spoken out and who had now been threatened with these suits to know that there were lawyers out there in the world who would represent them. And I ended up representing one of them, and Mr. Trump never did sue. He still hasn't sued, but I was able to help her figure out how to continue talking and giving interviews and speaking out. And then she knew that I'd be there, my firm would be there if he ultimately did sue. So I think the events in the campaign, putting all politics aside, really started to fuel momentum for what became the Me Too movement. My tweet led to another detour that I'll tell you about. A few weeks after, I guess it was late October, I received a call from Karen McDougal, who many of you probably know about now, but at the time, she had seen my tweet, and she said she had this issue. She had signed this agreement with the National Enquirer and its parent company that sold all her rights to tell her story about her year-long affair with Donald Trump just after Barron, Melania, and Donald Trump's son had been born. And she wanted to talk about it, but the National Enquirer had come to her and bought all the rights to her story forever, and then they never published anything. And then they had made promises that they would publish articles by her and other in their magazines, and they weren't doing that. So she was just very frustrated. There was an election going on. She had information that people were interested in. Reporters, including from the Wall Street Journal, were covering these issues and were on the trail. They thought that Mr. Trump and Michael Cohen and others were paying hush money to women to keep them silent during the campaign, but they couldn't really prove it because there were non-disclosure agreements. You've heard a lot about that. So I thought, this is a twist on my offer. It's broader because she's not being sued, but her First Amendment rights and her ability to speak out were being limited. So I got involved, and this was a couple weeks before the campaign, and the Wall Street Journal ultimately was able to break the story just before the election. And this is a screenshot of the article. And to me, it wasn't the fair part that was quite so relevant. I knew exactly what was happening when she contacted me, that this was part of a campaign where the National Enquirer, and from a journalistic standpoint, for you journalism students and law students, it was mind-boggling to me. They were paying to buy a story to kill it, and they called it catch and kill. And in fact, when the Journal reporter called the National Enquirer, they said, "Oh yeah, that was a catch and kill." They didn't even hide it. So I'd really never heard of that practice, but it seemed wrong to me. And the First Amendment, of course, protects news gathering, but it doesn't protect news killing. And it seemed to me to be highly newsworthy that David Pecker, who's the head of the National Enquirer's parent, who's really good friends with Donald Trump, was basically conspiring with the campaign, I thought at the time, and now Michael Cohen has pled guilty to it, to silence people during the campaign. And one of the violations that he pled guilty to was a campaign finance violation. So that happened. But as we know, Mr. Trump was elected. And again, I'll try and steer clear from politics, but I do think that now President Trump is really part of this story. The Women's March the day after inauguration, and it was more than women, but it was fueled by women with millions of people in the United States and around the world marching. The anger, the idea that someone who spoke the way President Trump did during the campaign about women, including one of his opponents in the primaries, about Hillary Clinton. We had a woman nominee, and we had this Access Hollywood tape, really fueled a lot of rage and anger. And I think that caused more women to be willing to speak out about some of the problems that women face in terms of sexual harassment and sexual assault. And that led to the Harvey Weinstein stories. It was apparently a well-known secret in Hollywood that Mr. Weinstein had this pattern of sexually harassing and even assaulting actresses and other women, but it had gone unreported because there were agreements, settlements, non-disclosure agreements, and I'll talk about some of the other tactics that kept it secret. And so in October 2017, October 5, the New York Times published this huge story that broke the story wide open. And the lead vignette was Ashley Judd going on the record about what had happened to her. And there were many other women in that story told what had happened to them. And there was a pattern that oftentimes there was a hotel room where the meeting was supposed to occur, and an actor would be invited to a meeting. It would be in a hotel room. You probably all know the story, and I'm going to let Ashley tell it in her own words here in a minute. But story after story that Mr. Weinstein had been engaging in this wrongful behavior, but much of it was many years ago. And so in Ashley Judd's case, she was in the middle of filming Kiss the Girls, which was a thriller and one of her first big, kind of bigger budget films. So her career was really in a great place. And Harvey Weinstein asked for a meeting at the Peninsula Hotel, so she thought it was going to be in a meeting room. She gets there and they tell her to go to his hotel room. And she goes up to his hotel room and he comes out and says, can I give you a massage? Do you want to watch me shower? Makes a number of, and she keeps saying no, no, no. And in her, she'll explain she was panicking. She felt she was trapped. And at the same time, she didn't want to offend the guy who at the time was the most powerful person in Hollywood. Academy Award after Academy Award. He was a power broker. He was the gatekeeper for success and for really rocketing to fame. So she came up with what she called a mock bargain and said, quipped, if I win an Academy Award in one of your films, then you can touch me. And then she fled the room. And so and Harvey Weinstein said, no, if you're nominated. And she said, no, if I win. She got out of there. But it was something that haunted her. And so she told her story here. Then in the New York Times, then the New Yorker broke its big expose by Ronan Farrow, which not only talked about sexual harassment in events like this one, but sexual assault and just even more serious physical activities that are now subject in New York of criminal charges against Mr. Weinstein. So that story broke wide open. And then the Me Too movement comes back. The Tarana Burke had started 10 years earlier. Alyssa Milano, the actor, tweeted, and again, social media comes into play here. If you've been sexually harassed or assaulted, write Me Too as a reply to this tweet. And that just exploded. And it became a truly viral moment where women all over the world were weighing in and saying, this happened to me. And so that fueled the fact that more and more women were coming forward with their stories of what happened to them. It just brought all these horrible events out of the shadows and created this dialogue. And that, as Professor Kirtley mentioned, led to women who had experiences like this with other men, often powerful men, and often in the entertainment industry, to come forward. And you know what happened. And that led to the Person of the Year going to the Silence Breakers. And I like the line. It's basically how the voices that launched a movement, which goes back to my point that the Me Too movement is a free speech movement. It's talking about these things, bringing attention to them, so there's a way to address them and redress them. I mentioned the efforts to suppress speech, and there's the threat of a libel suit is one thing, but Ronan Farrow, with another blockbuster story, recounted how Harvey Weinstein, in addition to libel threats, settlements, non-disclosure agreements, had hired private investigators, including this firm Black Cube, which is run by former Mossad agents, so they're former spies. And they had gone to enormous lengths to try to squelch the New York Times story and other reports. In fact, Rose McGowan, who has accused Harvey Weinstein of raping her, was one of their targets, and they had one of their people pose as a women's rights advocate and meet her and kind of get to know her and befriend her, all so they could try to get information from her to try to stop her from telling her story, to stop the news from coming out. So it's really remarkable. But that goes to my point about why we need strong First Amendment protections. The pressure on the New York Times and on the New Yorker was enormous to not break these stories. So the First Amendment, you have the victims and the women who came out and were brave and then saw that there was this whole community of women that had gone through this. Then you have the journalists who they then trusted because they knew the journalists would adhere to their ethics and respect their agreements with them. And then you have the news organizations that were gutsy enough to go publish. But at the same time, you had basically a private spy network, legal threats, and all these other efforts to stop it from happening. Another way that speech in the First Amendment had an effect goes right back to my Ashley Judd lawsuit. Peter Jackson, who I mentioned, he was casting the Lord of the Rings when Harvey Weinstein defamed Ashley Judd, read the story in the New York Times about what had happened to Ashley Judd. And he then, unbeknownst to Ashley, went on his own and gave an interview to Stuff, which is a publication, a website in New Zealand where he's from, where he explained that now it all made sense. He had loved Ashley Judd, thought she was fantastic, but Harvey Weinstein had told him and his production partner, Fran Walsh, that she was a nightmare to work with. He had had a bad experience with her, and they should not work with her. He said the same thing about Mira Sorvino. And they felt terrible. So they, on their own, disclosed this in the press. And to Ashley Judd, this was news. This was like a shock. She had no idea this had happened 10, 15, whatever, how many years it was before. And so that's how we realized we have a claim, because statute of limitations are a couple of years. So on the sexual harassment part of it, or what happened in the hotel room, too late to bring that claim. But retaliation and defamation, which you didn't know about until this was December 2017, that's when the statute of limitations starts to run, when you find out about something that was hidden from you. So that gave us a claim, and a very serious claim, that went to the economic effects of sexual harassment and sexual assault. And with that, maybe I'll just play a clip from ABC News where Ashley explains things in her own words.
The ABC News exclusive, actress Ashley Judd fighting back against disgraced movie producer Harvey Weinstein. Judd filing a new lawsuit claiming he damaged her career, detailing how it was he blocked her from getting major movie roles. And she says it was retaliation after she rejected his sexual advances. ABC's Amy Robach with the one-on-one.
Tonight, actress Ashley Judd sitting down for her first TV interview after filing a new lawsuit against Harvey Weinstein.
You are now filing this lawsuit against him. Why now, and what do you want?
So what I want is for Mr. Weinstein to be held accountable for his illegal conduct.
One of Weinstein's most vocal accusers now suing the disgraced former movie mogul, claiming he hurt her career for decades, retaliating against her for rejecting his sexual demands in an LA hotel room back in 1997, where she says she narrowly avoided sexual assault.
It has now been found.
Judd says a year later she was in talks with director Peter Jackson to play a role in the blockbuster trilogy The Lord of the Rings. Weinstein allegedly telling filmmakers she was a nightmare to work with and should be avoided at all costs.
My rebuffing illegal sexual harassment in a hotel room, that Harvey Weinstein lied about me and interfered with my economic opportunity and blocked me from being cast in Lord of the Rings.
In an interview, Peter Jackson saying he'd been fed false information that he now realizes was a smear campaign in full swing.
We heard directly from director Peter Jackson. He says that Weinstein torpedoed your incredible professional opportunity to star in the Lord of the Rings franchise. What was your reaction when you heard him say those words out loud and publicly?
I felt very sad when I heard that. I had a lot of processing to do. You know, I felt I'm going to get upset about it. It's very upsetting. And then all of a sudden, mysteriously, we never heard back from Fran.
You thought you were going to be used in this franchise.
I was being invited to consider which of the two roles I preferred.
And then all of a sudden, poof.
It was just poof. I was being maligned and defamed.
Judd's attorney acknowledges there are a lot of people seeking damages from Harvey Weinstein.
The evidence from Peter Jackson, we have got strong legal theories, and I think we're going to collect money and we're going to put it to a good cause.
Judd said she will donate any money won in the civil lawsuit to the Time's Up movement. Weinstein has denied any allegation of sexual assault and has not yet commented on Ashley Judd's lawsuit. He has said in the past that while he and his brother Bob were executive producers of the film, they had absolutely zero input on casting. David?
Amy Robach tonight. And Amy, I know you'll have much more of your exclusive interview with Ashley Judd first thing in the morning on GMA.
So it was, you know, when Ashley approached us and said both that she wanted to bring this case, not only to collect money, but then to put it to a good cause, we agreed to give any legal fees we normally would have received to Time's Up and to other organizations, really to make this a platform and a vehicle to affect change. And the suit got a lot of publicity. That was part of our strategy, was to say we're fighting for these issues, but to make it broader, to not just make it about Hollywood and in the entertainment industry. Ashley has a good line that she wants to she has forgiveness for Harvey Weinstein, but she wants a remedy and wants justice. So that's it's actually not a bad mantra as a lawyer. You can forgive people, but we can still get a remedy and send a message and punish and deter, so people won't engage in this kind of behavior anymore. So we filed our complaint back in April, and as I mentioned, one of the core claims is defamation, and it's kind of the basics. Back when defamation was invented centuries ago, it was this kind of thing. It was a private false statement, a libel or defamation that went to someone's profession was called libel or slander per se, because it was such an obvious thing that could cause economic loss, as opposed to something more amorphous where you'd have to judge how the damages, what are the damages. But here, we're in the sweet spot for what defamation was really all about from the beginning. And we argue, as I mentioned, that it's not governed by the statute of limitations, because Ashley didn't know about the defamation part of it until December 2017. Mr. Weinstein filed a motion to dismiss and argued that the claim was untimely for the reasons I mentioned, but then had a more startling argument that I still cannot believe they made the argument. I mentioned the mock bargain part where Ashley said, I've got to get out. We allege in the complaint, she feared she was going to be physically assaulted, and allegations from other women bear out that was a well-founded fear based on what happened to them. So she made this mock bargain with him. In their motion to dismiss, Mr. Weinstein's team said he wasn't, in later years, he'd come up to her and mention this bargain, saying, remember that deal we've got? And she was just trying to stay away from him, but still, he's a power broker. Their claim was that our claim was baseless, because what Harvey Weinstein was really trying to do was to get her in a movie and get her an Academy Award so he could sleep with her. That was their legal argument. And they made comments, his criminal lawyer made the point about, well, everybody knows the casting couch in Hollywood. That's just how it is. So they were trying to defend, calling that insensitive would be putting it mildly. The judge did not accept that theory. I'm happy to announce, so the judge denied the motion to dismiss in a very strong, clear legal opinion on 3 of our 4 claims, including the defamation claim. So we're moving to discovery, hopefully the deposition of Harvey Weinstein soon, a trial. The one claim that he granted their motion to dismiss but gave us a chance to amend was a claim under a statute in California that allows for sexual harassment claims where it happens, sexual harassment in a professional relationship. So we argued that, well, this is a professional relationship, it applies to us. Weinstein's team argued, well, it's never been applied in this circumstance. So the judge wanted us to give more detailed pleading. And one of the reasons we wanted to bring the case was we feel, of course, there should be a law that prevents someone in this sort of situation where there's a producer or someone who's going to hire or is the person who can green light the film or green light your role. If they engage in sexual harassment or other behavior or retaliation, there should be a remedy for that. So we're filing our amended complaint later this week. So it was not hard for me to decide this claim was different than where I'm representing journalists who were sued by someone like Donald Trump for defamation, where the journalists are reporting on issues of public concern. And that really comes from the Supreme Court's decision in New York Times versus Sullivan, which pretty much everything you need to know with a few tweaks comes from New York Times versus Sullivan in 1964. And that was the case where the Supreme Court, for the first time, said that the federal Constitution, the First Amendment, imposes restrictions and limits on what state courts and state law can do when it comes to punishing speech or allowing defamation claims. And it's such a crucial principle, but it wasn't obvious that the court would go that way. And so the court ruled that in that case and in subsequent cases that where there's a public figure, public official or a public figure, someone who's a public on the public stage, that person, if they're the plaintiff and they claim someone lied about them or published a false story, they have to prove at a bare minimum that that person acted with actual malice, which is knowledge or reckless disregard of the truth, and they have to show it by clear and convincing evidence. And there's some other First Amendment restrictions. And the court's rationale was the First Amendment's purpose, which was to allow for public questions to be debated, freedom of expression upon public questions. The First Amendment was fashioned to assure unfettered interchange of ideas for bringing about political and social changes desired by the people. And the court, in one of my favorite quotes, says that the United States has a profound national commitment to the principle that debate on public issues should be uninhibited, robust, and wide open. And also said whatever is added to the field of libel is taken from the field of free debate. So the focus was on public speech and debate and the kind of information that is in the public sphere and the kind of information where the public and citizens are gathering information so they can figure out how their lives should proceed and how the government should be run and how to govern themselves, not the situation that our lawsuit addresses, which is where you have a powerful person using defamatory speech to retaliate and punish someone who wouldn't succumb to their sexual advances. So it was a very easy call for me to say, here's a libel claim I can embrace and bring and fight hard to win. That brings me back to Donald Trump, who I could have made this all about Donald Trump, but I resisted that impulse. But as you probably all saw, I know you were all cognizant of the Kavanaugh confirmation hearings, and I don't want to relive that. But as you know, Dr. Blasey Ford testified, gave her testimony, and what she got in return from that from President Trump was he started first by saying she was very credible, seemed like a fine person, and then all bets were off, and he started to mock her. And if you listen to this and think back to his Gettysburg Address, it sounds very hauntingly familiar. So this is a very short clip. So he's talking, he's giving a rally while the confirmation hearings are still going on, before there's a vote, and here's the president.
What he's going through, 36 years ago, this happened. I had one beer, right? I had one beer. Well, do you think it was, nope, it was one beer. Oh, good. How did you get home? I don't remember. How'd you get there? I don't remember. Where is the place? I don't remember. How many years ago was it? I don't know. I don't know. I don't know. What neighborhood was it in? I don't know. Where's the house? I don't know. Upstairs, downstairs, where was it? I don't know. But I had one beer. That's the only thing I remember. And a man's life is in tatters. A man's life is shattered. His wife is shattered. His daughters, who are beautiful, incredible young kids. They destroy people. They want to destroy people. These are really evil people.
I believe it was. Good memory. Yes. Thank you for the Minnesota connection. Thank you. That's not saying anything about Minnesota, but there's several things about that. On the one hand, there's a legitimate point that there needs to be a fair process when you have serious accusations of wrongdoing against someone, whether they're a public figure or not. And so there has to be fairness, and it can be very damaging and terrible. At the same time, and I think libel law, as it currently is constructed, does provide a fair process with the actual malice standard. We have to prove actual malice in our case for Ashley Judd because she was a public figure. We can do it. But if there's a blatantly false statement where there's no support for it, where recklessly made, then you can sue. So there's a process and there's a way to deal with it. But that said, this is why women, I'll just focus on women for now, don't come forward and don't speak out, even in more private settings. But here, to have the President of the United States basically retaliating against someone, whatever the merits, really kind of brings it all together why we need strong First Amendment protections for individuals, citizens, who want to come forward and speak about public issues and about public people. So all of this made me think a lot about social media, because so much of this relates to social media. The Me Too movement, President Trump is a notorious user of social media. Someday people are going to look back at the Twitter feeds like in 100 years and just say, this was a period of madness. I mean, it's just an angst and just anger, and people were troubled, and it's just, but from a First Amendment perspective, there's never been more public speech. So private people can tweet like my tweet. You know, I tweeted, and all of a sudden, people with millions of followers were retweeting it, and so tens of thousands of people saw it. And so it got me to thinking about one of the other rationales for the actual malice standard. And as I mentioned, it's limited to public figures. If you're a private figure, under Times v. Sullivan and the cases that follow it, then states can allow you to recover for defamation just for negligence. So if I made a negligent false statement about Professor Kirtley, under some laws, and we'll call her, I think you're a public figure, but we'll call you a private figure for now. But I'd argue you were a public figure at least. Then you wouldn't have to show actual malice. But if you think about the rationale for that, one of them was that public figures have a platform where they can respond. They're famous or they're public. So if a false statement is made about Donald Trump, he's got the bully pulpit. He can go, that's false, you're lying about me, here are the real facts, and it gets broadcast widely. So it's not unfair to hold him to a higher standard when a public figure sues. But with Twitter and Facebook, private figures, if something truly false happens, can tweet or make a posting, and they will get attention. The record can be corrected. And oftentimes, private figures are involved in issues of great public concern. So after New York Times versus Sullivan, there was a battle on the Supreme Court as to whether there should be this distinction between public and private figures in terms of triggering the actual malice standard, or whether it should be a public concern test. And you don't look at the nature of the plaintiff. And it seems to me with the platforms that we have, social media, the public concern test, which the court ultimately rejected back in the 60s and 70s, really makes a lot more sense, because there's a way for private individuals to correct the record. Journalists, if it is an issue of public concern, they will pick up on it. It will get publicized. And so instead of lawsuits, which can be terribly ineffective, defamation cases can be, if you have to get a lawyer, you have to litigate. There's a way to correct the record through speech on these social media platforms. So I think that sooner or later, it's probably not going to be for a while, because the Supreme Court has shown no interest in defamation cases for many years. It's been decades since they took a defamation case and a First Amendment case. They haven't taken the Supreme Court has not taken a First Amendment case involving the media for 17 years. So they've had all kinds of other First Amendment cases, very pro-First Amendment in campaign finance and other areas, but nothing on these core speech. Freedom of the press is in the First Amendment. But I think it's going to be a few years before we have a court that decides to broaden the First Amendment protections in this context. But in this world, you need to take the long game and look ahead. And I think this area is an area where the First Amendment protection should be broadened and the standards made more strict in any kind of public discussion and public concern. The other way that social media has upended traditional First Amendment thinking is you've just got so much more speech. I mean, there is a defamation. I bet you while we've been talking, there have probably been 1,000 defamations that have occurred on social media. And so one could say, well, we should make it easier to sue for defamation. But that would mean the courts would just be filled with defamation cases. But I think the fact that you have the ability to make corrections, so let's just focus on news organizations. Back in the day, when I first started practicing, to get the New York Times or anybody to correct something or to change something could take weeks. I mean, if at all. And then it would be on page 2 under the corrections and amplifications thing, and you wouldn't even know what the article was about. Now, I've had experience where I just call or email the reporter and say, that's incorrect, can you fix it? And then they will immediately fix the posted version of the story, and then the print version will be correct. So there's instantaneous ability to correct things. And if it's a serious fact that could damage someone's reputation and it's just wrong, you can get it corrected much more quickly and instantaneously. And it will get tweeted and retweeted. And so there's been this, I think, really powerful ability to both make false statements, but then to correct the false statements much faster than you ever could before we had these social media platforms. The tricky part is when you have somebody like Alex Jones and InfoWars and the Pizzagate controversy, where it's really just absolutely false, incredibly damaging, threatens private citizens and businesses with conspiracy theories and the like. But there I think the law as it stands, or even amended as I'm suggesting to focus on public concern, would provide ample basis for a libel suit when you have just some crazy, malicious conspiracy theory that you could easily prove it was actual malice in making the statements, or if with my public concern test, making up a fake controversy would not be a matter of public concern, in my view, under the test that I'm going to persuade the Supreme Court to adopt in 10 years. So I think having more First Amendment restrictions on libel cases is something that social media, kind of counterintuitive, especially since I'm bringing a libel case, but would be, I think, good for our democracy. And at the same time, not all libel cases and not all defamation cases are bad. And that's why I brought the case for Ashley Judd. As I said, the Me Too movement is a product of brave people speaking out with the First Amendment to protect them. We have the victims who came forward and told their stories, made their claims, made their allegations. You have the journalists who have come forward and reported those stories, who gathered the facts, who were able to get the sources to trust them by adhering to the values that journalists need to adhere to, honoring your promises to sources, and reporting the facts. The First Amendment is really part of that story. At the same time, when a powerful man retaliates against a woman for rebuffing his sexual advances, and then secretly defames her, that's a defamation case. I don't think the First Amendment really has much, if any, concern with that. And time's up for that kind of behavior in this country. Thank you very much. Excellent, thank you. Should we go over here?
Yeah.
Perfect.
So we're going to have a little chance for all of you to talk to Ted and ask your questions. I'm going to ask a couple of questions to start him with. Did you get one of these mics?
I have one right here.
Okay,
Yes.
Excellent. I wasn't sure you'd gotten
Secret.
it. Wanted to make sure everybody could hear all your important words. But I do want to ask a couple of questions before we open it up to all of you. And the first question I have is, so President Trump, as we know, has famously said he wants to open up the libel laws. And this has puzzled many lawyers because we know that the president cannot do that by executive fiat, and there's no federal libel law, really. I mean, the constitutional issues, yes, but we don't have federal libel statutes. So, is this just nonsense, or is this something that he could actually do?
Well, it really, in some ways, is nonsense for the reasons you state, that libel laws are state laws. Somehow, we need the Supreme Court to change the First Amendment standards. There are areas, though, that, sort of eliminating the immunity that a platform has from defamation would really start to clamp down. So under federal law, as it stands now, if you're, say, Facebook, and someone goes on and commits defamation, you can't be held liable for that defamation. So there are federal laws that someone who viewed the media as the enemy of the people could try to tinker with or try to pass some statute. So I guess in some ways it's great that Congress is unable to actually pass very many laws. But, but I do think it's part of a pretty big threat that you have the president talking that way about First Amendment values and attacking the press and trying to blur the difference between facts and not facts. And so that's a big threat.
Not to mention that he himself has been the beneficiary of the very broad libel protection you described. We've spent most of our time talking about libel, but for the benefit of some of my students in one of my classes, I'd like you to, if you would, talk a second about privacy law, though, and I'm talking about tort privacy law in this context, because I think we concentrate primarily on the defamation aspects of what arise in the Me Too movement, either for the accuser or the accused. But what about invasion of privacy issues, especially when we're talking about victims who are, in some cases, coming forward voluntarily and identifying themselves, but in other cases are making these accusations anonymously?
It's a very good question. It kind of goes back to the public concern test, just to start with. The Supreme Court has said in the privacy area, and this really comes from the common law, that, for example, for journalists, if a journalist publishes something and it's of public concern and it's truthful, the First Amendment bars that as a invasion of privacy claim under state law. And I think here, where you have allegations relating to famous, powerful people who are controlling information. Again, another media angle here is so many of these individuals who became the subject of the Me Too allegations are in the media and the news world, and so I think those First Amendment principles would protect reporting even about private individuals and their names. You know, the whole line of cases where even a rape victim's name, where it comes out in open court, it's a matter of public concern, it's in court, that can be reported on. So in the lead case, and this is actually the last case that I mentioned, that where the Supreme Court talked about a media law issue, is called Bartnicki versus Vopper. And there the court held that where a radio station got a hold of a tape that had been illegally recorded, it could be published because it was a matter of public concern, even though there were privacy interests in it, and drew that line.
We'd like to open it up to you. And so we have two of our able Silha research assistants, Sarah and Scott, that have microphones. And if you'd raise your hand if you'd like to pose a question, and we would just ask that in the interest of time and giving people all a chance to be heard, that you keep your questions short and to the point. So, questions? Don't be shy.
Everyone over here?
Okay, this is working. Hello, thanks for coming tonight.
Thank you.
So my question would be, when you were talking about the kind of, relaxing is probably not the right word, but free speech on social media and the First Amendment, do you see like that kind of change you were talking about coming more through the common law, through like Supreme Court decisions, or through enacted statutory law, especially with the way the court is now?
Yeah, I think probably we are going to see more efforts to hopefully not regulate too much social media platforms, because I think that could really create a real chill. And at the same time, I think the platforms, some of them are my clients, so I'm not speaking on their behalf when I say this, but they're looking at their own standards to do more self-policing of what goes on in a way that is, makes it an open forum for public debate without intruding on free speech. I think that you're probably right. With the Supreme Court, I guess they've shown no interest, and so it's going to be a while. Common law and states can do a lot of things. So state Supreme Courts, the Minnesota Supreme Court, can kind of make law and create great, even broader protections than the First Amendment. So I think what we're going to see probably in the First Amendment area and free speech area and other areas where, and we've already seen some of this, where the federal Supreme Court may be going in one direction, state Supreme Courts and state legislatures and the common law development through the state court system in particular can create broader speech rights and change the law. So I think it's a really good question.
Before we take the next question, that reminded me of something I wanted to ask you. When you mentioned state law, Minnesota is one of the states that still has criminal defamation on the books. And we've seen in this state a number of cases that have been brought against what I would characterize as kind of non-conventional media, bloggers and others. And you know, there's been a willingness to prosecute people. You've already gone over to the dark side by representing Ashley Judd in her case. What do you think about criminal libel in the context of Me Too, or criminal libel, period?
I mean, I am against criminal libel, and so I think again, it's a very difficult area. So that, you know, you have just absolutely clear-cut defamation claims, and the kind that I'm bringing for Ashley, I think, as I said, doesn't really raise First Amendment questions. On the other hand, when you're talking about criminalizing speech, that's a real danger. That's an even greater deterrent and threat. And one of the rationales for Times versus Sullivan was that civil damage awards, like criminal penalties, the threat of them can chill you and stop you from speaking and publishing. Actual criminal penalties for publishing or speaking, I think, just are so chilling that I think we should not have criminal libel in any context.
Good to hear.
Yeah. I've not gone over to the dark side. I'm on the bright side on both issues.
Many years ago, when I was still at the Reporters Committee, I had a book author come in to try to persuade me that the Reporters Committee should join him in a libel suit that he was bringing. And I said, I'm sorry, we can't support that because of the risk of making bad law. And I think it's ignoble, you know, for a journalist to bring a libel suit. And he told people and said, you know, Jane's never met a libel suit that she could tolerate. So
well,
here we are.
No, I know, and I mean, that's, you know, generally been my approach. It's interesting you should say that, but another development that I found really somewhat disturbing was that I think it was the Daily Beast did a piece about how a number of media figures, including Jeff Fager at 60 Minutes, when reporters were reporting on him and allegations about his alleged inappropriate sexual behavior in the workplace, he hired this law firm, one of the law firms that specializes in sending the nasty, frightening letter and trying to, they actually say on their website, they kill, we kill stories. So the 60 Minutes producer hired, now he's no longer the 60 Minutes producer, but hired these law firms to try to chase off the Washington Post and other reporters. So I do think that is not right. It's not like your instincts back in your Reporters Committee days were correct. Now, one other point though, reporters are under a lot of pressure through threats and harassment now. Mm-hmm. And so there's another issue there. Do they have any remedy? I mean, just and women reporters in particular online. I mean, it's just outrageous. So there's got to be some way to fight back. It's there are threats to safety and the like. Defamation suits, I don't think, are the answer.
Okay, we've got other questions here.
Yeah, so I was wondering, kind of in the Me Too era, I remember this story isn't exactly specifically what I'm asking about, but I remember reading maybe a year ago, Matt Damon and some other actor maybe were paid or told by Harvey Weinstein to cover up a story or something like that. I can't remember the exact details, but kind of that got me thinking, do you foresee any legal implications for people who were, quote unquote, maybe complicit? I mean, what kind of legal implications would that have? Is that something that will happen in Hollywood?
Well, it's very interesting because there are allegations, for example, that Harvey Weinstein's production company, that his assistants and others were they knew what was going on, and they were helping, usher women into the hotel room and that kind of thing. And so I think, if there's that sort of situation under tort law, it wouldn't be defamation, and it was that sort of system that was going on, people who participated in it, there could be liability. And some of these things, the thing, it was really interesting when the Harvey Weinstein reporting came out, all these women found out that what happened to them, some version of it, had happened to all these other women. Famous women, less famous women, the hotel room, shower, all this, it was just, over this modus operandi, and that they had kind of a system for doing it, and some of them have expressed deep regret about that. So I think there are issues there where someone participates in that kind of behavior.
So I was wondering, how do you think litigation for libel cases such as those in the Me Too movement, like libel cases that have kind of more of a sexual assault undertone, are going to change now with Kavanaugh's confirmation to the Supreme Court?
It's interesting. There's sort of two pieces. So there's the potential defamation claim by someone who's accused. So I'll use Donald Trump, for example, where, and after this latest controversy, and you heard President Trump saying that, he was talking about the harm to someone accused. And of course, there can be harm to someone who's falsely accused. But the thing about these libel cases, the threat of them it really can deter and it's exactly why many of these stories had not come out. So I think it will really be interesting. The problem for a libel plaintiff, so Mr. Trump, the piece that Professor Curley mentioned that I wrote for Politico was in the midst of right after my tweet about why I had offered this. And one of the points I make is, if Donald Trump brings a libel case against any of these accusers, then he's basically got to defend the facts. And so you get discovery. All of a sudden you've got the legal process. And I think someone who is engaged in that conduct is unlikely to bring a libel suit and see it through because of the fact that it most likely will expose what actually happened, and it's very dangerous to them. So I don't think we'll see a big spike up of individuals suing for libel when they've been accused. But that said, I do think that our legal system has to be fair. But as you probably know, the data shows that false accusations are a minuscule percentage in terms of accusations that are made in this area.
Yesterday, a federal judge dismissed the defamation case with respect to Stormy Daniels and Donald Trump. Are you in a position to elaborate as to the principles of law that were being applied and whether the judge got it right, wrong, or partly right?
Yeah, it's very interesting because it is true. President Trump has really benefited from these First Amendment principles and these libel principles. He won another libel case arising out of the campaign in New York. And in the Stormy Daniels case, the judge said, I'll paraphrase basically, but that President Trump's comments were in the middle of this really kind of political firestorm and back and forth between President Trump, Michael Avenatti, Stormy Daniels' lawyer, and it was caught up in this really political brouhaha, and that's kind of the essence of what the First Amendment is meant to protect. The statements also were, they weren't like really factual statements about Stormy Daniels. They were statements about saying that what she said was wrong or that what she said was the hoax. The claim was that I can't believe that we're talking about this about the president, but that the drawing of the guy that she says threatened her if she was revealed her affair with her contact with President Trump, President Trump said that was a complete hoax, it's a con job, it's false. And so I think the combination of not really being a factual statement, a defamatory statement directly about her, plus it being in this public sphere in the middle of a political fight is why the court dismissed the case. So I thought that was a tough defamation claim to bring to begin with, especially in that context. And so I think the judge was relying on pretty core First Amendment principles in that one. We're going to have there is going to be like a separate body of law from the Trump administration that will be a book, Trump Law. Yes.
You can go first. Don't worry.
Oh, James.
But we'll come back to you.
You alluded to one of the ways that women are silenced is through these non-disclosure provisions in settlement agreements and other agreements. What kind of legal challenges can be successful to let them have voice? Are there, and do you see the law developing in that direction at all?
On the latter point, I do see the law developing in that direction, particularly some of these egregious examples, and where you have these terrible events and the systematic effort to silence women in a pattern, like with Mr. Weinstein. There are a number of arguments that can be made that get made. One, that they are unconscionable, that they were, that they're harsh, they're one-sided. There's arguments when there's criminal conduct that they don't bind you, and that the prosecutors can get the information. And I think the other thing about them is the main enforcement mechanism is often some sort of liquidated damages provision. And courts can be very skeptical of those, where a person without a lot of money, I think in the Stormy Daniels clause it was $1 million for a violation, that's so excessive and so extreme and one-sided that that's just not enforceable. But I do think courts are going to be more skeptical of those sorts of clauses, and sometimes they can serve a valuable function. Both sides have a settlement and they don't want, someone wants to remain anonymous, they resolve the issue. It's perfectly fair and appropriate and a good way to resolve a dispute, including this type. But sometimes they're used as a device to muzzle speech and to conceal a pattern of downright evil behavior.
On the similar topic of libel and defamation, I wanted to hear your input about the differing legal strategy from the Hulk Hogan v. Hustler case and how you approach Me Too and the role of privacy.
Well, it's interesting. The Hulk Hogan case is again part of the, I think, momentum for more of these libel threats and more libel suits. There have been more libel suits, really since President Trump got into business here in politics. There's one, some Russian oligarchs sued Fusion GPS and BuzzFeed, and they're all, people are suing more. And Sarah Palin sued the New York Times because of an editorial that they wrote. It got dismissed, but now it's on appeal. The Hulk Hogan case, I think, really fueled that because it was, it literally, the verdict destroyed. This is kind of the nightmare scenario that we thought about, that you could put a publisher out of business for publishing something. And it wasn't a libel case where the information wasn't true. It was the dissemination of this sex tape. And that does have privacy concerns. And the argument there is they settled, so we don't know how the courts would have come out. The public concern argument there is, questionable. It's a hard case to make, right? So that's kind of an example where the law, you can bring a case and win, a privacy case or a defamation case. And Jeffrey Toobin at the New Yorker did an excellent piece where he talked about how sort of the new way to go after speech is not to say it's false, but to say it's true and it hurt me in this way, kind of the point you were making and that you're making, that it invaded my privacy, and to attack this, what really is public concern. That's really not public. So Hulk Hogan, it's not a public concern. Pretty clear he wasn't that concerned about those sorts of things all along until he was funded in his lawsuit by Peter Thiel. And so there's a real problem there too. Thank you for reminding me, where you have wealthy legal funders funding these libel cases against publications that the wealthy people don't like. That's a real problem. That is a big danger. And not even saying that speech was false, and they put Gawker out of business. So that, I think, is going to make other wealthy people say, hey, this is worth a try. Let's go for it and let's see what happens. And the litigation funding on those sorts of things, whether you don't even know that that's what's going on, is really scary, putting my my First Amendment advocate hat back on.
Thank you. We're glad to have you.
I still got it.
I believe you.
lost it.
There's up there. Okay.
Way up here. Your description of the Weinstein comments to Peter Jackson suggests that you may be looking at an application or an expansion of Green Moss Builders versus Dun & Bradstreet, where the Supreme Court said that the First Amendment protections don't apply in a very narrow group, private exchange of communications. Maybe you are, maybe you're not expressly relying on that case. But would your theory have changed if Weinstein had given an interview to the Hollywood Reporter, for example, and said, gee, you know, I'm done with Ashley Judd. She's just too hard to work with. Everybody ought to avoid her, and a much more broad description, and she is obviously a public figure in that context. Might have done her even more damage, but would the same argument that you're making legally apply?
That's a really interesting question. I think we would make the same argument that, look, this claim was made for malicious, recklessly, knowing it's not true. And therefore the actual malice standard is satisfied. But it's closer to the sort of circumstance where one could say, talking publications about actors and examining how they are on the set, there would be a closer argument that that's more of the sort of public discussion. And here, and your Green Moss point is very interesting. Here, it was just literally, it was secret, and it was, as we allege, meant solely for the purpose to damage her and retaliate against her and to be able to, hurt her career. And the other thing about it that's interesting is that once Peter Jackson came out and did this interview in December, Harvey Weinstein then responded, and he didn't say, oh, yeah, she is terrible to work with. He said, oh, no, I liked working with Ashley Judd. She was great. So he basically has now conceded that the statements were false. He just denies making them. So it's really, it's going to come down to Peter Jackson versus Harvey Weinstein. And I think Peter Jackson is going to be vastly more credible. But I think it would be a slightly different issue. We'd be making the same arguments, but there'd be a different dynamic. The fact that it was secret, in private, and in our circumstance, I think just makes our case a lot stronger.
While they're getting the mic to the
Yes.
next person, that made me think of something else, which is you've been representing media outlets for a very long time, and you're a lawyer, you're not an ethicist, but I just wonder, from an ethical perspective, do you think there are particular issues that journalists face covering these Me Too issues that might not exist in other contexts?
Well, I mean, you referenced one sort of, you always have to honor your source, your promises to sources, but because it's the dynamics of the agonizing decision whether to come forward, and reporters can be very, very, I wouldn't call them tricky, but they have their ways of kind of working you around. If I'm talking to a reporter about something and I don't really want to go on the record or give out information, but they'll kind of come at me from 5 different directions, and then suddenly I realize I've kind of, there's a danger if I go one more step, I'll be revealing something that I didn't really want to reveal. And so it seems to me, just from an ethical standpoint, when it's something that intimate and personal and agonizing, and I think that's probably why the reporters who got these stories, remember the Roy Moore stuff too, those reporters did a great job. I think it's probably because they were sensitive on those issues that they got the story. So it's both more ethical and more effective. So I do think there can be different moral choices when you're a reporter, depending on the subject matter.
But from looking at it from a different angle as well, we think about when journalists are, covering criminal investigations. I mean, let's talk about, just classic criminal investigations. they're getting information from the cops, they're getting the information from investigators. They have to make decisions about whether they're just going to take that and run with it or whether they're going to try to independently verify it. I mean, we're kind of operating from an assumption here that those who are making the accusations are being truthful and so forth, and as you say, the vast majority of them are. But what ethical obligations do journalists have to go kind of beyond that, and what kind of risks do they run in terms of trying to verify or get the other side?
Right, that's the kind of thing that can reveal what's going on, that
Right.
can, I mean, I do think there is an obligation to have, check out the information, check out the accusation, and check out the information. And it can be tricky because that activity can sometimes reveal the information. It can reveal the information to the person who's being reported on. That's, I think, what happened in the Weinstein. They knew the New York Times was doing a story, so suddenly, the Mossad agents were sent out to jump on things. But I think reporters, while they need to be sensitive, actually need to be able to report and do their jobs and look for the facts. And where it's an issue of public concern and a significant issue that has ramifications for society, being sensitive to the individual circumstances, being honest and ethical, but then you have to do your job, gather the facts.
So I first heard about this case when the New York Times Daily podcast actually did a story on it. And I was wondering, what has it been like for you to work on a case that in lots of ways a whole country is watching, as opposed to a normal case that the public doesn't know much about?
Yeah, I go back and forth between those sorts of cases too. I have so many cases that none of you would want to hear about. But it is interesting. It's a different dynamic because, very conscious of the need to, not try your case in the public and to be respectful of the court rules and all those issues. But in a case like this, you want to make sure that you're describing the issues in a way that are fair and accurate to the public. Since it is a social issue and an issue that really has a lot of public attention, being part of the public debate in a fair way is really important because, as I mentioned, this is part of the broader effort to affect change. So, when we rolled out our lawsuit, we had a game plan. It was to the New York Times and ABC, and because the New York Times had done that first story, so we felt that they would be fair and they knew the issues. So it is a different place. And also, we're up against someone who, both Mr. Weinstein, but his PR team and his lawyers, they're very active in terms of making public statements and responding. So you have to kind of think ahead to that. And so it's a very different dynamic. I've had a number of cases like this. We handled the case challenging Proposition 8, the same-sex marriage ban in California, where it was just, we knew we needed, we wanted to persuade the public, people that didn't necessarily agree with us, that we were right. We wanted to make it not a political issue. And it was very important just to be able to describe those issues publicly, in addition to just writing the briefs, putting the trial on, and arguing the case. So it's definitely different.
Oh, gosh.
Yes.
It's been a little more than a year since ABC paid a 9-figure settlement in the so-called Pink Slime case, which was venued not all that far from here. As someone who represents media outlets, looking back and looking forward, do you think that settlement is having or will have a chilling effect on investigation of powerful corporations? Or do you think it's just a one-off?
Your Honor, that settlement really did concern me because it was so big, and it was, I think particularly with respect to companies, that kind of settlement does make organizations think twice about going after a company. Less so in the political sphere because, right now we have, you saw the New York Times story about Donald Trump's family finances. It was just, this epic story. and they published it, and it's from start to finish, and it's not been questioned. But I do think with companies that have significant funds, those sorts of settlements, I don't have any empirical evidence, but my sense is that that kind of big settlement, it wasn't even the final challenged award.
Yeah. I mean,
What do you
we
think?
really don't know how much it is.
Right,
just
we
know
still don't
it's
know.
lots and lots and lots of money.
Yes, so I think that makes people think twice, especially if it's not the most newsworthy story. I mean, that was public health and other issues, but if it's a story of less compelling, they might not do it.
Right.
Yes.
So many of the cases that we're talking about today are cases that happened 15, 20, 30, 40 years ago. How would your experience today dealing with those cases advise working women today in the workforce, where they often do not report sexual abuse because fear of not being able to get the next promotion? Especially, how would you foreshadow what women should do when most of the cases aren't with the head of a publishing firm or corporation, and they're more mid-level?
I think you really put your finger on a crucial issue, and I think the most important thing that employers and companies can do is to have a system where women feel that they are free to go report things and that they will not be retaliated against. And I think emphasize that, having a system, and I think that's in part, as I said, when we brought this lawsuit for Ashley Judd, knowing that it's a completely different circumstance, but pushing this issue and having companies and employers, and I think this is going on. All of this has caused even more of an awakening. Companies think they have a good system, and they don't realize that the employees don't trust it. And so I think it's almost less so on women and others who are going to report things, that every company and organization needs to look at their system and say, let's make this a really good system. Let's make it fair, responsive, and so people will come forward. And I think that the Me Too movement and all of this, I think, is contributing to that, where you can really change structures to have an effect so it doesn't get hidden and people feel they can't come forward.
I want to thank you all for coming and joining us tonight, and please join me in thanking Judd.
Thank you. Thank you.
Good night. I hope we'll see you at the lecture next year.
Thanks again.
Okay, we have to take some pictures.
Oh, good. I'll take my mic off. Oh, don't.